All right, I'm going to go ahead and start the welcome because I want to have a chance to, we're going to have a long conversation with our artist who's a guest today. So I'm going to go ahead and welcome you all to the 7th Annual Siddiqi Lecture in Islamic Studies. So on behalf of the Department of Religious Studies, I am Tina Shepherdson, the chair of the department, and I want to welcome you to this webinar, this lecture. We wish we could be with you in person. Thank you for joining us here virtually. The Siddiqi Lecture is endowed by Siddiqi Holdings, and we would like to give our sincere thanks to the Siddiqi family for the support of the academic study of religion and Islam in particular on our campus. We're also very grateful to our campus co-sponsors, College of Arts and Sciences, several departments, the Department of English, of History, of Modern Foreign Languages and Literatures, Political Science, and the School of Art, as well as interdisciplinary programs in Global Studies and Middle East Studies, as well as the Haslam College of Business and the College of Law, and most especially the UT Humanities Center and its director, Chancellor's Professor of English, Professor Amy Elias, who is also going to be our webinar host this evening. We are very grateful to her. Our Board of Visitors for the Department of Religious Studies has been very supportive of this and our other endeavors, and we thank them for their support and their attendance today. The Department of Religious Studies promotes the critical and comparative study of religion and draws upon a range of perspectives that highlight the variety and the complexity of religious beliefs, practices, communities, and institutions. So we're thrilled to have you join us this evening for tonight's lecture, which is a pre-taped conversation between my colleague, Dr. Manuela Ceballos, and our guest, artist Shahzia Sikander. This will last after the introduction. The video is 70 minutes and it will be followed by a live Q&A period where the guest will be with us. So get comfortable, get something to snack on if you want to. I know that it's dinner time for some, and the live Q&A will start around 6:45 with our guest Shahzia Sikander. And in the meantime, you have a treat to look forward to. I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, Dr. Manuela Ceballos, who teaches Islam here at the University of Tennessee, who will introduce our speaker. Manuela?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're delighted to welcome you to the 2020 Siddiqi Lecture in Islamic Studies, and I'm thanking my colleague, Tina Shepherdson, for her introduction. I'm Assistant Professor of Religion here at the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Tennessee, and my specialty is Islam. Since 2014, the Siddiqi Lecture in Islamic Studies has enjoyed a great deal of popularity in our campus, which testifies to the need for more conversations about the richness and diversity of the Islamic tradition. This year, I was very, very happy with the possibility of our coming together in person to gather around Shahzia Sikander, a highly acclaimed Pakistani-American multimedia artist and recipient, among other major accolades, of a MacArthur Fellowship, and whose artistic practice, and I'm quoting from her website, takes classical Indo-Persian miniature painting as its point of departure and inflects it with contemporary South Asian, American, feminist, and Muslim perspectives. I was excited to open up the lecture to an artist, and especially one of Sikander's stature, and to have her discuss her trajectory, her engagement with Islamic narratives and the Persianate artistic tradition, her ways of displacing, translating, experimenting with classical forms of art, and with different histories. However, as we all know, 2020 has been a very, very strange year. And so we find ourselves in different spaces, still coming around the subject that interests us and brings us together, but far enough away that there's a strangeness to this year's gathering. Shahzia Sikander, who opened up a new exhibition entitled Weeping Willows, Liquid Tongues at Sean Kelly Gallery in New York City, has joined us or will join us later for the live Q&A, but we had to pre-record our session. I want to give a really, really brief background on her work because the interview that we're about to show is incredibly academic and rich and dense, and a little bit of a background on her and her life might help guide the audience along, alongside her images, which are dazzling in their beauty and complexity. Sikander was just featured in major news outlets like the New York Times, The Nation, and also Vogue magazine and Harper's Bazaar. She was born in Lahore, Pakistan, and earned her BFA in 1991 from the National College of Arts in Lahore, where she received rigorous training from master miniaturist Bashir Ahmed, becoming his first student and artist from the miniature painting and first student and artist from the miniature painting department to challenge the medium's technical and aesthetic framework. Sikander's breakthrough work, which we will talk about today, The Scroll, received national critical acclaim in Pakistan, winning the prestigious Shakir Ali Award, the NCA's highest merit award, among others. Sikander started teaching miniature painting at the same school in 1992 alongside Bashir Ahmed, which was also a testament to her talent. She, in the late 1990s, and to early 2000s, her work became prominent in the international arena. And this is after she moved to the United States to pursue an MFA at the Rhode Island School of Design from 1993 to 1995. Among the numerous awards, and there really are too many to list, grants and fellowships, she has received the Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Award, the South Asian Women's Creative Collective Achievement Award, the Tamga Imtiaz Medal of Excellence from the Pakistani government, the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, and I could go on, World Economic Forum, prize from the World Economic Forum. I really can go on for a very long time. She has exhibited all around the world and been appointed to the Mayoral Advisory Commission on City Art, Monuments and Markets in New York City, where she currently lives. She also now serves in the boards of Art 21 and the Rhode Island School of Design. Her artistic trajectory, however, is not easy to summarize in a soundbite. She's dazzling in her breadth. Very that it was a non-academic, but an artist who was so historically committed and constantly studious and intellectually challenging for me. This semester, my students have been studying and admiring her work and have been moved by the power of her images. The Siddiqi Lecture has opened up a space at UT for the Partnership of Islam, for the academic study of Islam, and we are very thankful that we have been able to explore controversial issues such as figurative representation in Islam within a framework of respect and with the understanding of Islam as a tradition of debate. My questions for Shahzia have been very much shaped by my students' interventions and their intellectual generosity, their aesthetic sensibilities, their curiosity about current events, and their willingness to fill in my gaps of knowledge and ability. I'm very thankful to them and to Shahzia for joining us. So if we can play the video.
Stop anywhere and ask any questions about any particular work. So I was born in Lahore, Pakistan. I grew up in Pakistan. My journey towards art was an outcome of coming of age during Ziaul Haq's military dictatorship of the 1980s and the Soviet-Afghan-US Pakistan War, which is 1978 to 1992, is in the background. So this was a time of diminishing women's rights, human rights, emergence of certain blasphemy laws, very much a polarization of public-private spaces, all geared towards discouraging dissent and creative expression. So this sort of emerging, stifling culture that I recall was very opposite to the personal experience I grew up. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how to move my slides. So it was counter to the personal experience I grew up with regarding belief and spirituality, the intrinsic mix of secular, spiritual Muslimness that I experienced in my immediate family and community. I was also inspired by many other women leaders like Asma Jahangir, Pakistan's human rights activist, who was also one of my first mentors. Another mentor was a late artist, Lala Rukh. In 1986, I also worked with Lala Rukh at Seymour Foundation, a women's resource and publication center, while I was studying mathematics at the Canadian College for Women. And she was also a founding member of the Women Action Forum. So being a part of the Women Action Forum gave me substantial insight into women's rights and issues, as well as a broader grasp on the intersections of community and art. So she's the one who encouraged me to apply to the National College of Arts also. At that time, growing up in Pakistan, there was no real culture of museums in the 1980s, and much of the art I often thought was in any case dispersed or stolen, and that's just the legacy of the colonial histories. So when I graduated from the National College of Arts in 1991, and in the spring of 1992, I was already teaching as a lecturer in the miniature painting department. So I was the first female to teach there in the history of the department, in the Department of Miniature Painting.
Was it immediately after you graduated?
Yeah, soon after, within a few months. So, this is a very interesting time, because at that time, miniature painting, or this traditional practice of miniature painting, was not popular among my generation. It wasn't popular among the young artists. And this is also sort of, myself included, when I encountered it in 1986, it was mostly mired in its prevalent iterations of tourist kitsch, much more than its indigenous status, and it had been declared derivative. So within its colonial history at the National College of Arts itself, miniature painting was intimately woven into the English provenance of reviving the Indian crafts. So some of these images that you are viewing here are also all of my work, but most of them were initially copies that one made of older paintings in an attempt to learn the technique also. And then some shifts start to happen in this particular set of work, where I'm bringing in, personal iconography into the paintings, maybe a different type of perspective, storytelling, people that I know are entering the work. And, it became clear to me that tradition in context to the Indo-Persian miniature painting craft was truncated at best. Miniature painting, with its unresolved national status, almost like a deep stigma, captured the paradox of culture and nationalism far more than any other discipline at the National College of Arts, in the shifting geopolitical landscape of the 80s. So for those here to explain that don't know the term miniature painting, which unfortunately is not the best way to refer to a very broad visual, painterly, historical practice of a vast geographical area. So if I think of it, I'm thinking in terms of Eastern Europe, Ottoman, all the way into India, South India, as well as China. And it's loosely determined as book art, illuminated manuscripts, illustrated folios, sometimes accompanying literary epic poems, religious texts, court paintings, Indian, Persian painting styles, which encompass many regional schools such as the Safavid, Sultanate, Bahari, Mughal, Sikh, Rajasthani, Deccani, Company, and many more.
Can I ask you, just for the sake of our audience too, what's the scale that you're working at in miniature should indicate something, despite the problem with the name. But I think it's difficult for people to imagine just what this actually looks like beyond the PowerPoint.
The ones that I was sharing and the ones that I was making before this particular work were all notebook page scaled works, which doesn't mean that traditionally miniature, like an Indo-Persian painting, ranged in size also. They are really large scale works, incredibly detailed, but they are larger ones. But at that time, in terms of what was being done at the National College of Art in the late 80s, when I was there and graduating, my thesis started a trend of making singular large scale thesis projects. So this particular painting, the scroll, is 5 feet in its width and about 13 inches in its height. And it emerged as a tipping point, laying to rest the debate about miniatures' inability to engage the youth. You know, it started a trend of large scale miniatures, as I said. Well, I got a lot of recognition. So when the thesis came about, it won a lot of awards, and I was on the cover, I think, of the Frontier Post with the Prime Minister at that time. So this Safavid use of storytelling in my very first experimentation with miniature activated the boundaries of the house in this work, the scroll, which captured for me the psychological dimensions of a house via its residents and their various functions within the house's physical nature, as well as the role of domestic labor, including different class structures. So, you know, when I was painting the scroll, it was not important whose house it was. What I wanted to depict was the transitory nature of life, where the house is not just one abode, but a spiritual notion from the historical Safavid painting.
And there's one figure that keeps, is that you?
Yes, so there is that figure of the spectral female figure, which I think is coming because I wanted to upend the fetishized virtuous figure of the many sort of static waiting women in traditional miniature paintings. Mm-hmm. And that's what I was trying to replace with this diaphanous spectral female protagonist defying bodily restrictions by virtue of its very resilient elastic form. And for me, that kind of claiming of the freedom of the female body became really kind of a very defining idea, iconography, as well as the emotion in the work. For me, also a rupture of moving away from the prevalent layers of patriarchy. So there's all of that happening, but at the same time, I'm also looking at Safavid painter Behzad's tightly compressed, perfectly balanced language of the interior-exterior spaces with the local vernacular of the eminent architect Nayyar Ali Dada's architecture. So I was kind of playing with architecture, geometry, engaging with local language of form, as well as creating a relationship with something which went further back in time and history than the colonial scholarship on miniature painting.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you why the Safavid.
I think that for me, that was really important, was to use something that went further back than just the 19th century scholarship, which was for me kind of problem. It wasn't very exciting because most of it often was very descriptive and not necessarily taking much more of a conceptual or more of an approach that as a visual artist I could take much more freedom with it. So I think like what is also interesting, like this is a picture with Bashir Ahmed, my teacher, later. This is, I think, 2 years ago. Like my interest in this genre was sparked by my own lack of general knowledge about visual histories of the region. So the more I became attuned to miniature painting's complicated provenance, the more it yielded to new narratives. And miniatures are often hiding out of sight in Western Museum storages or in private collections yet to be published. So then it became really interesting that what was this idea about the provenance, about the expunged histories, about archives, about who gets to tell or frame the story. And, so the more I started to take closer look at historical works, documents, unarchived materials as inspiration for my work, the more it kind of opened up many ways of interpretation. And the language started to really evolve. So I started to kind of play with iconographies which were parallel to my experience, because the journey to explore the personal had already started in Pakistan in my work. But with the distance from home, the process of self-actualization came into focus. The new work started to resist the straitjacketing that I encountered in terms of my biography. Who I was, what I represented became limited constructs as the burden projected onto me to represent a culture felt not just unfair, but almost alien, becoming the other.
This is when you're here now in the US, when you come to
then you can see sort of the work starts to shift. It gets different types of iconographies are starting to evolve. There's a lot of engagement with body iconographies of severed bodies, androgynous forms, armless, headless torsos, this sort of self-rooted female floating figures, sometimes half human. They are reminiscent of female and children's bodies. Borders started to collapse.
Yeah, I see in the previous image, I see you working outside of the border. The language is still very recognizable, but now everything seems to be kind of exploding.
Yeah, I think like how I was thinking of it later was like learning how to drop fear, embrace vulnerability, to live the true potential of the mind with all these burning questions was very exhilarating. So it wasn't just like I was simply creating new narratives in the miniature style. It was really about digging deeper to really understand how do you take ownership of tradition, or what is this idea of tradition, and how can iconography come from within, which is not appropriated from older paintings.
But also different traditions. Little Red Riding Hood, you completely upended in one of the previous images that you showed too, right? So it's different traditions coming together too, and being questioned and being challenged.
Yes, so I felt, I started to breach national boundaries to dismantle control over women's bodies in visual and national representations. So alongside people at that time that I was reading, say Western feminist linguists or scholars, I was also juxtaposing that some of those rereadings of texts with other Pakistani feminist scholars too. So Ismat Chigtai, Kishwar Nahi, Fatima Marnisi, they start to sort of interface with bell hooks, with Helen Sassoon, Julia Kristeva. So like, these are things that I kind of were happening that were leading to all these very fertile ways of engaging with the feminine form, but also in terms of disrupting the center margin discourse. And I thought that the framing devices within the manuscript books allowed me to play with these ideas in a much more tactile manner.
And this happens this is after graduation from
Rhode Island School of Design. Like, yeah, I think a lot of it is already had started to happen because, as I said, I had finished I had done a rigorous sort of 4 years after a bachelor's at the National College of Arts. Then I'm already there. I'm teaching for a year. Then by the time I come to the US, I've had time from a bachelor's degree. I've had experience in the field. And then the 2 years of graduate school is I'm choosing to continue in that language, though at that time, in the 90s, there was still there was very little information available. You had to cull your space out of a very bizarre idea of like this big space called the third world feminism.
Right.
Like what exactly did that mean? It was just the idea.
And it doesn't have to be biographical.
Yeah, one big category in which, you know, what do you do with one big simplistic term like that? So, yeah, so moving through these histories, you know, some of the iconographies that are happening, I think we're punctuating the androgynous too. And I kind of was interested in these, how race and sexuality kind of intersect and how they can be fertile areas to also expand. So it's not just the idea of identity. And though that was a very easy and prominent box, often for whoever the other may be, that you get, you know, you found yourself being subjected to just this idea of identity, whatever that may mean, which was most of the time about biography. And my work was so not about a personal narrative. Of course, it's informed by who I am and what I'm choosing, but it was a very non-nostalgic engagement with the canon of non-Western painting also.
So you're questioning categories and looking also to draw connections between different media and different stories in order to maybe, I don't know, bring attention to the narrowness of those categories? Or is it something you're doing consciously? Is there something that just happens? And then as you look at your pieces, you think, it's always interesting for me to question what comes first if there is a process like that.
Yeah, I think there is obviously that one is feeling being boxed. One is also at a time when, you know, frame of references in terms of who the kind of histories or contemporary histories, visual histories of South Asia are not that prevalent in books. It's like pre-internet time. It's like 94, 93, 94. It's hard for me to share what it is with your students right now. You know, it's just impossible. Nobody can understand how different things were and how much things have shifted in the period of last 25 years. So I was definitely looking to kind of explode a very binary read overall. And that's inevitably going to play with creating new centers and new centers of narratives and kind of, you know, what I was doing was like these sort of spontaneous mark-making gestures. I was equating them like graffiti. So I was almost violating my own work in an attempt to unlearn and learn simultaneously. And also to sort of this spontaneous nature of it was disrupting the very perfect or this projected precious notion to the miniature. So I was questioning that this preciousness that is being projected onto a very, for me, intellectually exciting genre. Why do we have to talk or think of it always in terms of something, you know, decorative or beautiful or something that is precious? And that was problematic already, because that way of seeing meant that it was already, there was nothing intellectually vigorous.
It's not powerful in the same way that you wanted it to be.
Yeah. So much of this work kind of stems from those kind of all of these feelings and kind of using them as a fuel to create paintings which were also engaged with their political time. And this work for sure is done before 9/11, and then the show that I was working towards, the Asia Society show that I had in 2001, I think was scheduled for September. Of course, it gets postponed, and the work, I had the work back, or I still had the work, and I was able to add some layers on top. So sort of this kind of porosity is very integral to my process. I work in very precise ways, but then I want to keep the stories timeless or open-ended, or in ways that they can have multiple vantage points. So Pleasure Pillars, is also about, for me, as questioning my role as an artist and how I could contribute towards a new cultural code of acceptance and rejection. And that's also inevitable. Once the framing device, once the work exits the studio, it's going to be understood, framed, consumed in ways which are not necessarily in one's control.
Sure.
And so again, another kind of work that I thought I would just mention briefly here was, these are the armorial, eyeing those armorial bearings. The series for me calls into question visual symbolism and cultural semiotics in multiple contexts. It was, of course, inspired. I've talked about its work before too, with the Project Row Houses. And I was living in Houston at that time, so I did engage with the row houses, which was started in 1993, and I arrived there in 95. And I create these sort of logos for the row houses. I'm also looking at the representation of African American in medieval West, and kind of icon paintings, what the representation of Blackness meant, what was the politicized representations of the Muslim woman, and kind of reclaiming such associations, often very stylized and derogatory, via more positive representations through the reimagining of entrenched and contested historical symbols. So that's where that work is. And then I was also invited in 1999 by New York Times Magazine that was asking artists to imagine a topic that could be a turning point in the next century for their imagining the millennium issue. So my response was the interface of American foreign policy in Islamic countries, that it could become the polarizing and the defining moment. And this I did 2 years before September 11th. So, this work for me was very important, but it did not get reviewed or anything. It was reviewed 20 years later in 2017, when I was at View at the Asia Society in New York as part of the South Asian Art in the Diaspora exhibition. And at that time, Hyperallergic called it an American masterpiece. But the painting takes on many aspects: power, war, money, commodities, beliefs, censorship, through many players and shapeshifters. But for me, there's humor, critique to challenge entrenched, fixed historical representations. And I was using the illuminated manuscript to engage with pop culture and history. So
that says "Who's veiled anyway?"
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, it does. And so now I kind of wanted to also talk about one other work. So I'm going to show you the before, which is on the left, and the after. So the protagonist in this painting may appear to you as a veiled female, yet on close inspection with a magnifying glass, you can see that the stock character is of a male polo player from the Indo-Persian miniature tradition. So you could read it as a comment on patriarchal histories, or you could read it as a desexualizing of the miniature itself, evoking French feminist theorist Hélène Cixous's idea of the écriture féminine, often called white ink. I painted over the male figure with chalky white lines in an attempt to make androgyny the subject. It was also a means of tracing my own relationship with the largely male-dominated miniature painting lineage. So the use of white was also referencing the foundational element of the gud rang, a term which is the opaque color technique in miniature painting, which is basically white as the foundation for each and every color. So when the white is used as the body for all the color, I was removing all the color and using the body as a editing tool.
I see.
So, this way I'm playing with many multiple ideas. I'm thinking in ways on how I can keep continuing my interrogation of the miniature painting by making it exciting for myself, by bringing in many more topics, not just, here is a veiled figure. I was like, ridiculous. If you look at the border, it's already questioning this kind of projection on in a very sort of polarized way, like this obsession with like the women coming from a Muslim woman coming into as an immigrant into the US. So it kind of was talking about whose histories are being determined by those in positions of power, whether colonial, imperial, or nationalistic hierarchies. So in that sense, I think that the work often embraces uncertainty, flux, continues to do such. And I'm not looking to synthesize, but to elaborate and define difference. And there are infinite ways to create meaning. So when I research historical paintings, I inspire to cultivate new associations. And I've employed ideas around time, space, monumentality, movement in imagining new relationships with the past. So I've used strategies of scale, temporality, light, projection in various artworks created over the years in residencies and museums like the Hirshhorn, Whitney, Yerba Buena, Drawing Center, MoMA, in the one in Paris, Lahore Fort, Times Square billboards, you know, many more permanent works, recent permanent works, especially at the Princeton University.
And also playing with scale, but also you have animation. It's quite, if we're thinking of the miniature as a starting point, it opens up to all kinds of different things. It's beautiful to watch, and it's so exciting to hear you talk about the process. I wonder also how this was received, for instance, by your teacher and your classmates in Pakistan, or if they were as excited as you were by what you were doing.
Yeah, I think my work was very influential for a whole generation of artists, that it was signaling back that miniature painting was viable, valid. And, you know, when I was studying with Bashir Ahmed, I was one of just 2 students. And when I started to teach with him the year after I graduated, already, you know, the class had moved from a tiny room into a larger area. So we were getting more real estate in the college too. And, you know, from like 2-3 people to 4, 5, 6, 7, 10. And later there were many, like Bashir Ahmed retired in, I think, 2014. So so many people have passed.